In this video, I'll show you the fastest and easiest way to put great-looking heavy rust effects on your wargaming miniatures. Honestly, it's really fast and easy. I love adding rust effects, not like real rust of course, but paint effects to simulate rust to certain models and miniatures that I use for wargaming. It very easily adds a real kind of worn, lived-in look to any model that's supposed to be made out of metal, or supposed to look like it's made out of metal, but it's probably made out of plastic or whatever. Any one of those models that you paint. I've done everything from very simple rust washes on, parts of models to like chunks of rust that's supposed to look like chipped off paint with different degrees of old rust showing through underneath. For me, it's a fun process that I do towards the end of the paint job to give a kind of totally different vibe to the model and to make it look cooler, in my opinion. But I needed more. Specifically, I needed more rust for the Anchorite Shrine model for my Trench Pilgrims force for Trench Crusade. Trench Crusade, if you haven't heard, is a new skirmish game, with a very successful Kickstarter. I talked about it a few months back. Pachow, and I'm building a force from the Trench Pilgrims faction. The Anchorite Shrine is a 12 to 15 foot tall diesel-powered suit of deadly armor with a monk or a nun kind of locked inside as the pilot. According to the lore, they were built hundreds of years ago, and no more can be built as the plans were destroyed. The amazing art piece for this unit shows it completely covered in thick, aged rust. I find that look to be very compelling. To some degree due to the story of these ancient battle machines / shrines, but also because I'd never painted anything like it before. I initially thought I'd airbrush some, rust colors onto the model and then do some silver dry brushing over it to make it look metal, but I didn't think that was actually going to do the job that I saw in the art and, frankly, in my head. I love painting with airbrush and speed paints and stuff like that, but there's rarely any texture added to the model with that process. In most situations, I'm happy with the lack of added texture that my normal painting techniques bring to a model. Layer over layer over layer of opaque paint can sometimes start to look a little chalky on the surface of a miniature if you're not careful, and you may not want it to look like that, right? But here, I wanted to really see the thick rust texture. I wanted to be able to physically feel it, when holding the model. So I knew what rust paints I wanted to use because they already have micro textures built into them, and I'll get to them in a second. But I was trying to figure out how to apply those rust paints all over, which I usually don't do. Normally I just use a little piece of sponge to dab a little bit of that rust paint along the edges of the sharp parts of a vehicle or a robot or something like that, where they might hit something and then chip off the paint and then that area gets rusty. But I've never had to try to put it over the majority of a model before. Then I remembered watching some videos from master painter Richard Gray several years back. I've seen his stuff in person at Adepticon in the Golden Demon cases. It's astounding, but I'm not even trying to paint like that, right? But he did do this video about painting blood angels a few years ago, Pachow, and he didn't lay the red tones down on the Space Marine with an airbrush or glazes or anything like that. He instead used a stiff dry brush and just stippled the color on, just poking, stabbing, and then building up layers with slightly lighter colors of red and all that kind of stuff. And it looked really amazing, and looking at him doing that, I thought, well, at least that part seems pretty easy. And when he did it, even with non-textured paint, constantly stabbing the miniature kind of built up a tiny bit of texture on the surface of the Space Marine. And I remember at the time thinking, this would be perfect for using textured paint if you really wanted a severe textured look. Brushing on textured paint has a tendency to sort of accentuate brushstrokes massively because of the texture and the movement of it as you kind of put it on. So stippling it on, or like stabbing, really kind of helps to get rid of that problem. And it's pretty easy, too. Richard Gray is a master, and I'm certainly not, but this stippling action with textured rust paint is something that anyone can do. And, the rust that covers this model was eventually done in about an hour. So let me show you how I did it. Once I had the 3D printed model all glued together, except for the Catherine wheel that the shrine uses as a shield in its left hand, I kept that part off separately until later to make the painting and all the stippling and all that kind of on the model itself easier. I basically just primed it all black using my airbrush and the Army Painter Matte Black Air Primer. You could use a rattle can if you wanted to for this, but it was Wisconsin in January outside, so I used my airbrush in the house and I was, happier for it. After letting it cure overnight, which is kind of important to really make sure that you're not going to knock it off with all of the stabbing, then it was, time to start stabbing with a brush. You want a stiffer, round, domed dry brush for this. I used the Army Painter Masterclass dry brush set for all the heavy lifting on this project. A soft, bristled makeup brush won't work here. The bristles will work against you in the stabbing motions because they'll be very bendy, so you kind of need something that's stiffer. I started with Army Painter Fanatic Effect paint called Dark Rust. It is the perfect color. It's super matte finish when it dries, and it has these tiny resin microparticles in it to add a subtle texture to your rust. And when you stipple it on with a stiff round brush, again, best if kind of domed, then it makes a great texture on the surface. Don't worry if the dry brush doesn't reach into all of the deepest recesses on the model. That's why we thoroughly primed the model black. Any unrusty crevices become shadows very easily. When this behemoth was first built, hundreds of years ago in the lore, it was probably just put out on the field with just bare metal, not like polished silver or chrome, but just unpainted metal and, sent out to battle the forces of hell. So an overall rust coating like this makes total sense. Just keep stippling on the dark rust paint and building up the texture until you're happy with the look of the coverage. Then let it dry. They're subtle enough that they're a little hard to capture here on video, but the textures are certainly there, and they build up as you add layers and layers of this dark rust color. Feel free to put it on as thick as you want to in some places and less so in others. Once the dark rust is dry completely, then you can put on some fresh rust from the Army Painter Fanatic Effects, which has the same texture and matte finish, but it's a bit of a brighter orange, color to sort of simulate, strangely enough, fresh rust. When you first put it on, it might look too bright, but it does get a bit darker as it dries, like most acrylic paints do. The trick to the fresh rust is to kind of add it to taste. Don't actually taste it, but to your visual taste, right? I added a little bit more than I thought that I might like because I knew that the next step was coming and it would dull the brighter orange color down a little bit, right? Now, if you still want your rusty model to look like there's a bit of metal underneath, which frankly sells the look, it would be weird to have rust without metal, I think. But then what you do is that you dry brush silver metallic over the rust layers after they're dry. Now, you'd think you'd want to put the rust over the metal color to make it look like the rust is on top of the metal. But actually, this way works a lot better for just giving that kind of hint of metal underneath. I used the new John Blanche metallic silver called Heavy Metal for my metallic dry brush step. It's a great color, and it made sense to use it on this very grimdark model for a game that Blanche himself is contributing art to. Here, we won't be stippling or stabbing the silver on. We'll be doing a standard dry brush instead. We want to be sure to catch edges on things with the dry brushing, as like the edges on a unit, like its metal plates or its parts or different things like that. They would be more likely to rub against things like trees as it walks through the forest or as it walks through a brick wall or whatever. And, those edges then rub the rust off, showing the bare metal underneath. That said, you also want to make sure that you dry brush the smooth areas some as well. Since we've stippled on the textured rust paint, the metallic paint will stick to the raised parts of that texture left behind in the smooth areas when you dry brush them. This will provide a subtle metallic sheen on these areas as light hits the model from different angles, and will also pronounce the details on the model better as well. Again, do this to taste and build up slowly over time. If you overdo it on your first pass, you can't easily go back, so add silver dry brushing in many subtle layers. After you have that all done, you might have identified some edges that could use even more definition and metallic kind of edge highlight. I used the same heavy metal silver from before for mine, but you could use a brighter silver if you'd like. Get some paint on a thin, fine brush, right? And slide the side of that brush, not the tip, but the side of that brush along these edges you've picked out at like a good 45-degree angle. Again, start with just a little bit and build it up. You can always add a little more, but it's really hard to fix edge highlighting if you glopped on too much right away. At this point, you'll have a really nice heavy rust effect that was really easy and didn't take too long to do either. I got all of the rust and the silver dry brushing and edge highlighting on this big dude done between 9:30 to about 11 p.m. on Tuesday night this week, according to the timestamps on my video files. The next day, I spent a good deal more time doing all of the other details on the model, and I painted the Catherine wheel and the base and all that kind of stuff, and stuck the Catherine wheel on and sprayed it with like matte varnish and all that kind of stuff. It was probably about another 5 hours maximum, and then this big set piece for my Trench Pilgrim's Skirmish Force was done. This technique would work well on regular sized figures too. Like you'll just have to figure out how to not get the rust all over the other parts of the model, like the skin and the clothes and stuff like that. Let's say if you wanted like a really rusty helmet or shoulder pads or something like that, you'd probably have to, use this process on those parts before you glue them onto the figure, or maybe use tape or some other kind of masking solution so you only get rust where you want it. This technique would work super well on post-apocalyptic vehicles as well. And I have a special Imperial Knight project that this recipe will certainly be used on soon. This technique was easy, fast, and gave results that were better than I expected. You can easily do this too. All you need are some stiff dry brushes and some textured rust paints, like the awesome ones from the Army Painter. Check in the description down below for a Rust Effects bundle that includes both of these colors that I used in this video, and also the verdigris, effect paint too, that kind of green thing that happens on bronze when it sits outside and all that kind of stuff. And you can also get 5% off if you use my code at checkout. It's also down there in the description below. Depressmentation of the like button is helpful and appreciated, also while you're down there. And subscribe for more videos every single Friday. Thanks for watching.